So, hello again everyone. If you haven't already seen our radios tutorial, I highly recommend you do that first. But now we're looking at circuits. So, if we move on to the introduction, what is a circuit? Basically, near an airfield, you're most likely to have the highest density of aircraft. And what you don't want to happen is them all flying in different directions at different altitudes, and eventually, inevitably, there's going to be a collision. So, what we do instead is have a racetrack. That's all it is. Just go around in circles with the airfield sort of on one side of it. And this means that everybody's always going in the same direction, and everything's predictable, and it prevents crashes. And normally this is controlled by an air traffic controller. Sometimes it isn't, in which case it's the pilot's responsibility to look out for traffic in the circuit. So important information here is the standard Reaper's circuit is flown 300 meters above ground level, so it's important to know what height the ground's at. Speed is 500 kilometers an hour or 310 knots, and direction is left-hand. So somebody correctly pointed out that all of these diagrams are in fact right-hand circuits. So principles are exactly the same, but instead of turning to the right, you turn to the left. So some important terminology here. We have... So you take off from the runway and move on to the upwind leg. So here you're climbing out up to the circuit height. Then you do a 180 turn, known as the crosswind leg. Come onto the downwind leg, where you'd make a radio call. Then onto the base leg, where you call finals. And finally, the final leg is for you to descend and land on the runway. We also have two other things, is the circuit and dead sides of the runway. So these are important when you're joining and leaving the circuit, in that the circuit side is where the circuit is and the dead side simply where it isn't. Excellent. So we'll just move on to controlled versus uncontrolled airfields. So in the Reapers we won't always have somebody to do air traffic control. Today we will have air traffic controllers, and if you can understand how it works with an air traffic controller, then uncontrolled is dead easy, because all you're doing, instead of asking for permission, you're just going to state what you're doing. So the example here is air traffic control. You would say tower, hammer 1, ready for departure, runway 25. ATC would respond, hammer 1, clear for takeoff, surface wind calm, and you would obviously read that back. But in an uncontrolled airfield, all you're going to do is state what you're about to do. So traffic, hammer 1, lining up for departure, runway 25. So you're just saying, I'm going to line up for departure. Okay, everybody happy so far?
Roger, can I ask one point? This is rather than general aviation, I guess this is more for us. How do we determine, and who determines, whether a airport is left-hand or right-hand orbit? I usually just make them all right-hand orbit in our thing that we do, the mission plan, but that's only because I don't know what they're supposed to be.
Yeah, so the way it's done in real life is by default is left-hand. However, if there are some specifics to do with the airfield, perhaps there's a mountain on one side of the airfield, and therefore you cannot do a left-hand circuit, then they'll do right-hand. So I think for missions, we're going to default to left-hand. If no one said otherwise, left-hand circuit.
Right, Roger.
So we'll probably have to update the spreadsheet for that. We'll skip over radius reminders since we've just done that. So if we start with taxiing and takeoff. So first of all, you're going to ask for permission to taxi from ATC, so it's just simply ground, hammer 1, request taxi. Then the ATC will give you some taxi instructions, which usually will involve taxiing to a holding point that's short of the runway. So in this case, taxi to holding point runway 29 via November and Charlie being the names of the various taxiways. So you're going to make your radio call. Once you've given clearance to taxi, you'll taxi to just short of the runway, so not quite on it, and then you'll make your second radio call. And this will simply be saying ready for departure. Just tell ATC you're ready to go whenever they are. And you'll get three possible responses here. You'll either get hold, i.e. stay where you are, line up and wait, which is get on the runway, get ready to take off but don't, or finally cleared for takeoff, which is line up runway and take off whenever you're ready. And then whichever three of those three you get, read it back. Any questions so far?
You mentioned that the taxiways have names. How do we know what their names are? I'm guessing we don't.
So in DCS, you can. It's in your file somewhere. But if you also Google DCS aerodrome charts, then you'll find a nice handy.
So you have
list
to find them
of
yourself, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Sod it.
I can put up a link. All the charts are on the knee boards as well, but I'll put one in one of the text rooms, so you can open that on a second monitor if you have one.
Okay, but
Okay, so moving on to the next, we have taking off into the circuit. So you've just been cleared to take off by ATC, and you're going to apply full power and rotate at whatever speed your aircraft rotates at. Then you're going to be climbing on the upwind leg up to the circuit height of 1,000 feet. You can, if your aircraft is particularly slow at climbing, you can do that as a climbing turn. So before you get to 1,000 feet, move onto the crosswind leg and do your 180 degree turn, but still climb. And of course level off once you get to 1,000 feet. When you come out of the crosswind leg, you should be at 1,000 feet, 500 kilometers an hour, 310 knots, wings level, and you want to check that you're flying parallel to the runway. And at this point is when you make your radio call, so you're just going to say downwind, touch and go, runway 29, or whichever runway it is. And then you don't have to respond to this, but oh, hang on, there's a mistake in there. Ignore the response from ATC, that is a mistake. But usually ATC will just tell you how many people are ahead in the circuit. You don't have to respond to that, it's just a piece of information to help you. So on the downwind leg, you want to make sure this is flown quite accurately. So make sure you're not going too fast and running into people ahead, or going too slow, or making sure you're at the correct height. So you want to go through a work cycle of height, heading, speed. So look at your altimeter, look at ahead to see if you're going the right direction, look at your speedometer, and you think, right, I'm a little bit slow here, so I need a bit more power, or a bit high, so I'm going to just pitch down to correct that. You're constantly going height, heading, speed, correct, height, heading, speed, correct. And so you do that throughout the downwind leg, doing any checks that your aircraft require. And finally then we get onto the base leg. So here is when you want to start bleeding off speed, ready for your approach. So try and maintain your height throughout the base leg and just bleed off speed, and try and get it so when you come out you're at the correct speed. Midway through the base leg, this is when you make your final call. So you just go hammer on, final runway 29. And you'll get 3 responses here, either cleared, touch and go, or land, continue approach, or go around. So continue approach is carry on what you're doing, but you're not cleared to land yet. Perhaps there's an aircraft on the runway, and the ATC is waiting for them to get out of the way. They expect them to, but they might not. If you don't hear clearance by about 100 feet, you go around. So full power and pitch up. And same if you hear go around from ATC, go around. We'll just talk about that in a second.
So we've selected 310 knots. I'm guessing that's just for the Grim Reapers. That's not a commercial standard, obviously, because a lot of planes can't do that fast.
Yeah, it's because obviously we use a lot of jets, 310 knots. It works out so the slowest aircraft, excluding warbirds, obviously, can maintain that as well as the fastest ones.
Question: what sort of distance are your downwinds and upwinds and final legs? There's no sort of scale.
Yeah, so you probably just want to put your aircraft into about a 20-degree turn, and you basically just turn around, and that should get you a good distance away from the airfield. It doesn't have to be very precise.
But Blood, how can it be a racetrack if we're not giving them dimensions, i.e. miles? How can it be a racetrack? Because one guy will do a 1 mile circuit, another guy will do a 10-mile circuit, and nothing won't work.
Normally it's a ground marker that you use.
Yeah, so it can be dependent on the particular airfields, but you just generally get an idea. If you put yourself into a 20-degree bank all the way around, you should get out roughly in the right area. The idea is that nobody should be operating anywhere on the circuit side at that altitude, doing whatever they want to do, so that everybody should be going the same direction, even if they're not quite displaced laterally at the same amount.
And also, if you have strong winds, anticipate the turns, otherwise you end up in an egg-shaped pattern.
Yeah, so you need to make sure you're not drifting too much towards the runway or drifting away. That's a good point. Excellent, so let's go on to priorities and go-arounds. So, a go-around is an exceedingly important manoeuvre you have to know before you even start landing. Basically, if you have any doubt that your approach is bad, that your landing's bad, maybe there's somebody on the runway, or you've just got any kind of problem, you go around. It's far safer, if you're in doubt, to go around than it is to try and land from a dodgy approach. No one's ever going to say anything bad if you just go around. So, imagine for a moment our pilot is on approach. Somebody's feeding back here. And everyone ensure they got pushed to talk.
It's Cap.
Oh, is it
I mean,
Cap?
it's Cap. I'm not feeding back. Carry on, it's fine.
So, imagine we have our pilot, he's on his approach, but his airspeed's too low, far too low to recover. The stall warner activates, it's close to the ground, there's no way that he's going to get out of this, so what he does, applies full power, and once you've got enough speed to start climbing, you pitch up, and then you maneuver over onto the dead side of the airfield. So what you're trying to do here is not interfere with anything on the circuit side. And then you climb up to circuit height, and simply do a circuit again. And when you're doing this, you go hammer 1, going around. Remember, fly the aircraft first before you make your radio call. So don't worry about the radios until you've got your aircraft in a position where you're nice and safe and you're climbing away.
You also need to call them when you're re-entering the circuit.
No. At least it does. It may be in some specifications, but not the one I've looked at.
The full-time Reapers are getting good at go-arounds now, making decisions. We used to be really bad, but now the
Yeah, particularly when we have cap-style mega wind missions, go-arounds are vital.
Continue.
So we'll just look
mission.
at priorities. So if there's an air traffic controller, they should sort this out for you. But if there is uncontrolled, as we have on many missions, the priority goes, the person sat on the runway has priority over everybody because they're stationary, they're on the runway, it's very difficult for them to move. Next person has priority is person B, so the person on approach on finals, because obviously they're trying to land and somebody on the taxiway waiting to join, that they can easily wait an extra minute and wait for person B to go past. And then finally person C has the lowest amount of priority. And as it says big letters here, if in doubt, go around. Excellent. Any questions so far? Good. So next one, nice and easy, is just departing from the circuit. So after you take off, just simply keep on climbing, and when you're about 2,000 feet above ground level, so you're way clear of the circuit, just make a radio call, hammer 1, clear a circuit, departing to east, west, north, wherever. So dead simple. And then once you're free, head on to wherever it is that you're going. So next we have recovery to the airfield. So this gets a little bit more complicated, but you want to run through this quick pre-recovery checklist. So all you're doing is just checking what the information is at the airfield. So what direction is the circuit? Should be left hand, but may want to check. What's the active runway? What's the ATC frequency? So we're not sure yet whether in Reaper's missions we'll have a separate frequency, but if we do, you want to make sure you're on the same frequency as the tower, otherwise you could just be sending messages and nobody's listening. The other one is you want to check the QFE or surface altitude. So if you have come from an airbase that's perhaps 1,000 meters up and you come right down to one at sea level, suddenly your altimeter is going to read horrendously out. You should notice that you're not in fact at minus 700 meters, but you want to make sure that's changed to ground level. And then obviously change the altimeter, switch to destination airfield frequency, and you're all good. What I tend to do as well when approaching an airfield is look at it and go, right, which runway is it? Look at your compass to check, okay, it's the runway heading away from me, that's good. What direction's the circuit? Okay, it's left hand. So imagine yourself taking off from that runway, think, right, I turn left, okay, so the circuit is on that side of the runway. Try and visualize in your head where the circuit is way before you get anywhere near the airfield, and that'll allow you to set yourself up much more easily for the second part, recovery and overhead join. So this looks a little bit of a complicated diagram, but it's not too bad. So what you're aiming to do is enter on the dead side. So you want to keep well away from the circuit. You're going to be above it, so 2,000 feet, so 1,000 feet above anybody in the circuit to avoid deconflict. You're going to maneuver yourself up to what's known as the initial point. So that's 2 miles roughly from the runway threshold. Then you're going to carry along the dead side. To cross over the runway. Once you've crossed over the runway, that's when you're going to start your descent, and maneuver yourself onto the downwind, merge, and just carry on the circuit as you do normally. So to go through the radio calls for this, first of all, you're just going to let the tower know what you're intending to do, and then they're going to give you permission to do it. So, Hammer 1, 10 miles to the east of the airfield, let them know where you are, request overhead join. And then towers are simply going to say, join overhead, and then they'll give you some information. It's runway 23, left hand, 2 in circuit, report initials. So they're telling you there, the active runway is 23, it's a left hand circuit, there's 2 people in the circuit, and just let us know when you reach initials. And so, with the read back there, you just want to read back the important information, which is runway 23, left hand, and tell them you're going to report initials. So nice and simple.
Where is the initial point? Geographically.
So you see number 8.
Yeah.
Geographically, so it's 2 miles. If you imagine the runway is extended out to infinity, it's 2 miles from the threshold. You want to be slightly displaced off, so you make sure on the dead side, not the circuit side, so you don't bump into anybody on approach.
That makes sense.
Okay, so when you're at the initial point, just say, Hammer 1, initial. That means ATC goes, excellent, they've reached the initial point, which is a known point. I know roughly how long it's going to take before they get in the circuit. When you cross over the threshold, cross over the runway after travel along the dead side, this is when you want to call Hammer 1 joining overhead. And that lets any traffic in the circuit know that what you're doing, you're merging with the downwind. And then number 3 is just to make your downwind call as you regularly would, and carry on land. Any questions? Good. Everyone will be able to do it perfectly then, I assume.
Well, the question is, damn, this is hard to remember.
So you before you say joining overhead, you indicate that you've reached the initial point.
So yes.
At 8, and then at step 9, you say joining overhead once you're turning on the downwind.
Yeah, so these are sort of informative calls. So 8 is I'm at the initial, 9 is I'm joining overhead. So it's saying you're about to merge with the downwind.
That makes sense. Makes sense.
Cool. Obviously, this is a training environment. So if you do have any questions, just jump back in Discord off the radios, and I should be floating around, so you can ask them then. And finally, we have the final landing. So you're going to come into land. You're going to get off the runway, and only after you're off the runway, you're just going to say, Hammer 1, runway vacated, request taxi back. And then you should get some taxi instructions from ATC.
If there's an uncontrolled base, like most of ours, to be fair, do we just assume that ATC has agreeing, if you know what I mean?
Yeah, so everything you're doing there, you're just stating what you're doing. And if there is a problem, if perhaps some aircraft is broken on the runway, then they will respond and let you know. But the key thing about uncontrolled airfields is use your eyes. They're your best weapon against
So if we back up one sheet, number 7, if it's an uncontrolled airfield like most, Tower Hammer 1, 10 miles east of the airfield, we wouldn't say request overhead join because there's no one to answer it.
You would just say you would just say,
I guess.
Yeah, and then you would say traffic instead of tower or whoever's around that airfield.
Well, I think it was 6 tower.
6
tower. Tower's a good word for it, and it suits everything.
Okay.
Yeah, so what you do is traffic, Hammer 1, 10 miles east of airfield for overhead join.
Right. And if it's a controlled, then you do the request.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the only difference. And you'd still do things like reporting initials and joining overhead, because that's key information, so people will know where you are in the circuit.